Every holiday season, I show up to my family's table like clockwork, wallet open and heart half closed, because that's what you do when you're the one who made it out divorced, successful, and still somehow the family safety net. But this Christmas Eve, as laughter echoed around the turkey and the wine flowed like excuses, I caught my Aunt Linda's whisper cutting through the din. "He's just our ATM. Wait, no, that was me they meant, Sarah. The golden goose everyone pecked at," so I smiled. Played along, but inside, something snapped, and what if this year, the machine jams for good, leaving everyone wondering if the holiday cheer could survive without my endless contributions that had propped up their lives for far too long. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' old split-level house in Cleveland, the kind with aluminum siding that's weathered countless winters and seen better decades without a single fresh coat of paint to brighten its faded glory, right as the first snowflakes began dusting the windshield in that gentle way that always tricks you into thinking the season might hold some magic despite the underlying tensions that simmered year after year, and it was just 2 days before Christmas, with the air carrying that familiar scent of pine needles mixed with a hint of regret, the kind that settles in when you're heading into a family reunion that feels more like an unpaid tab you can never quite balance, no matter how many times you try to even the scales. I'd driven 3 full hours from my condo in Columbus, juggling real estate closings on my phone the entire way because work never pauses for eggnog or forced cheer, even if my family acted like it should. And Mom waved from the porch with her apron dusted in flour from whatever pie she was perfecting, yelling something about how she'd saved me a spot at the kids' table. No, wait, that was her attempt at a joke that landed flat because at 45 years old, I'm still treated like the responsible big sister who never quite escaped the role of caretaker despite all the independence I'd carved out for myself in the years since my divorce. Inside the house, everything unfolded into a whirlwind of tinsel strung haphazardly across the mantel and tension that hung in the air like unspoken debts. With Uncle Bob manning the grill out back, where he flipped burgers for the pre-Christmas barbecue, because Dad insisted on upholding that one rigid tradition even if it meant everyone ending up with frozen toes from standing around in the biting cold, while Cousin Mike slouched on the living room couch nursing a beer that seemed to be his constant companion and scrolling through job listings on his phone that he never actually followed up on. His wife Jenny chasing their 2 energetic rugrats around the space like it was some kind of exhausting contact sport that left her frazzled and him oblivious to the chaos he contributed to every single time. And there was Aunt Linda, my mom's older sister by 5 years, perched at the kitchen island like a self-appointed queen on her thrift store stool, doling out generous slices of apple pie while her eyes lit up with that calculating gleam the moment she spotted my leather handbag. The one that quietly screamed, "I can afford this lifestyle," unlike the rest of you who seem perpetually one step away from financial quicksand. We'd been locked in this uncomfortable dance for what felt like forever. Ever since my divorce 5 years earlier when I clawed my way into a solid career in real estate by cold calling leads at the crack of dawn and showing properties through blizzards that would have kept most people huddled indoors, turning those commissions into enough stability to pay off my lingering student loans and even build a small nest egg that I guarded fiercely against the constant encroachments from relatives who viewed my success as a communal resource rather than the result of 12-hour days and countless skipped vacations. That left me exhausted but proud. $100 here to cover Mike's latest car repair that always seemed to happen at the worst possible time. $200 there for Linda's so-called medical copays that mysteriously stretched to fund her weekly bingo nights at the local hall where she'd chatter about jackpots she never quite hit. And I didn't mind it all at first, because family is supposed to stick together through thick and thin. That's the narrative we all grew up with in this middle-class American bubble where Hallmark cards peddle the idea that blood ties are unbreakable and generosity flows freely without keeping score. But as plates clattered in the sink and stories flew back and forth across the crowded living room, Dad reminiscing about his days on the factory line before automation stole those jobs and left him scraping by on a pension that barely covered the utilities, Mom fussing endlessly over the ham glaze to make sure it came out just right for the main event, I felt That familiar pull tightening around my chest like a credit card statement you've been ignoring until it suddenly demands payment with interest that you never saw coming. That's precisely when it happened, the moment that shifted everything without anyone else even noticing. As I stepped into the cramped laundry room off the kitchen for just a quiet minute to catch my breath and dodge the overwhelming chaos of overlapping conversations and children's shrieks, only to hear their voices filtering through the thin wall that separated me from the heart of the house, Linda's tone sharp and unfiltered like a clearance sale knife cutting straight to the bone as she said, "Sarah's got money to burn these days. She's just our ATM. Always has been, and without her, we'd be sunk," followed by that low, knowing laughter from Mike and Uncle Bob that carried the weight of years of shared secrets and unacknowledged dependencies. My stomach twisted in that instant, not with immediate anger that would have made me burst through the door and confront them right then and there, but with a cold, dawning realization that hit like icy water. The kind you feel when you finally see your own generosity reflected back not as a virtue, but as a fool's errand that everyone else has been exploiting without a shred of guilt or reciprocity. I froze there with my hand gripping the doorknob tightly, my mind racing through all the times I'd wired money without a second thought or covered tabs at family events just to keep the peace, wondering if they truly meant it as some harmless joke passed around over beers, or if it was the unvarnished truth they'd been whispering behind my back for longer than I cared to admit, a truth that made my hard-won independence feel suddenly fragile and exposed. Of course, I let it slide in the moment because that's what I'd always done, walking back into the fray with a smile plastered firmly on my face that no one could see through, clinking glasses and hollow toasts, and complimenting Jenny on her festive ugly sweater that she wore every year like a badge of reluctant holiday spirit. But as the afternoon stretched on with plates emptying onto the coffee table and the kids smearing cranberry sauce across the walls in their messy enthusiasm, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all watching me a little too closely now. Their glances lingering like hawks circling a paycheck they assumed was theirs for the taking without ever earning it through their own efforts. Linda cornered me eventually by the dessert tray in the dining area, her hand landing on my arm with that overly familiar squeeze while her voice dripped with sugar-coated spice, saying, "Sarah, honey, you're an absolute lifesaver as always. Mike's fallen behind on rent once more this month. You wouldn't mind spotting him a few bucks to tide him over until his next gig comes through, would you?" And I nodded along, murmuring something vague about wiring it later that evening from my hotel because old habits die hard even when your instincts scream to pull back, but inside, the gears were already turning faster than ever before, grinding out a plan that would rewrite the rules of this game they'd been playing at my expense for so long. That night, as I drove back to my hotel through the thickening snow that blanketed the streets in a deceptive white hush, I replayed her words over and over in my head like a loop I couldn't pause. Our ATM, fine, if that's how they saw me. Then maybe it was finally time to change the entire dynamic and show them what happens when the dispenser runs dry without warning or apology. But what they didn't see coming, not in their wildest assumptions about my predictable generosity, was how I'd start pulling the plug with one quiet, calculated move after another that would build toward something they never expected. And little did I know as I checked into that sterile room with its faint smell of industrial cleaner, the real storm was only just beginning to brew in the shadows of the holiday lights, ready to hit hardest when everyone least suspected it at the heart of Christmas dinner itself. That whisper from Aunt Linda lingered in my mind like a bad check that keeps bouncing back no matter how many times you try to cash it out for good. Replaying endlessly through the next morning as I sat in my hotel room sipping bitter coffee from a styrofoam cup and staring blankly at my laptop screen, where I pretended to prepare listings for upcoming property showings, but really just stewed over the implications of being reduced to nothing more than a family cash machine after all the sacrifices I'd made to lift myself up from the wreckage of my divorce and build something stable in a world that seemed determined to pull everyone back down into the muck. By noon, I found myself driving back to Mom and Dad's house for the annual cookie baking session that always turned the kitchen into a flower-dusted battlefield of rolling pins and half-hearted holiday cheer. with the air thickly scented by ginger snaps and vanilla extract that masked the underlying tensions bubbling just beneath the surface like dough rising too fast in an oven set too high, and as I pulled up, I could already hear the kids' laughter spilling out from the open windows, mixed with the clatter of mixing bowls that promised a day filled with forced togetherness, and the inevitable requests that always followed like shadows trailing behind the festive lights. To truly grasp why her words cut so deeply into the core of who I thought I was in this family dynamic, you have to rewind the clock a bit to understand the roots of my resentment that had been growing quietly for years without anyone bothering to water them with even a drop of appreciation or reciprocity. Picturing me at 38 years old, fresh off a messy divorce from Tom, that deadbeat who believed flipping houses meant he could quit his steady construction job to chase some vague passions that never materialized beyond a garage full of half-finished projects and excuses piled higher than the unpaid bills. We split everything down the middle. In the end, with me walking away with a modest condo in Columbus and a renewed sense of grit forged in the fire of late-night arguments and court dates, while he slunk off with his collection of alimony-dodging schemes and the freedom to drift without ever facing the consequences of his choices that had nearly sunk us both before I finally cut the anchor loose. Throwing myself headfirst into real estate became my lifeline. Starting with cold calling potential leads at the crack of dawn when most people were still hitting snooze on their alarms and showing empty properties through relentless blizzards that would have kept sensible folks huddled by the fireplace with hot cocoa, until those grueling efforts paid off in commissions large enough to wipe out my lingering student loans from that business degree I'd earned back in my 20s and even allowed me to tuck away a small nest egg in a savings account that I guarded more jealously than any treasure because it represented the independence I'd fought so hard to reclaim after years of playing second fiddle to someone else's dreams. Meanwhile, the rest of the family seemed to be sliding steadily in the opposite direction without any apparent effort to grab hold of the rope I kept throwing their way. With cousin Mike dropping out of community college after 2 semesters of half-hearted classes that he claimed were too demanding for his creative spirit and bouncing from one dead-end gig to the next like a pinball in a machine rigged against him. Aunt Linda retiring prematurely from her longtime cashier position at the local grocery store only to lean heavily on her Social Security checks supplemented by questionable side hustles that carried the faint whiff of pyramid schemes peddled at church basements. And Uncle Bob still clocking in at the auto repair shop day after day griping endlessly about how millennials ruined the economy while never bothering to save a single dime from his overtime shifts toward the retirement he talked about but never planned for. They all viewed my upward trajectory not as the hard-earned result of 12-hour workdays filled with client negotiations and property paperwork that left me drained but determined, but rather as some kind of windfall lottery win that existed solely to bail them out of the holes they kept digging deeper with every impulsive decision and avoided responsibility, turning what should have been celebrations of my progress into subtle undercurrents of envy and expectation that eroded the joy right out of family gatherings over time. We were already knee-deep in the cookie dough that afternoon when Dad pulled me aside into the dimly lit hallway away from the kitchen frenzy, his voice roughened by decades of factory noise and unfiltered cigarettes as he mentioned casually how the roof had started leaking again during the last rainstorm, and how the insurance company wouldn't cover the repairs without a fight that neither he nor Mom had the energy to wage. So I sighed inwardly, knowing full well what was coming next, and slipped him the contact information for the reliable contractor I used on my own properties, along with my credit card details, because handing over help had become as automatic as breathing in this toxic cycle where my generosity was taken for granted like the air we all shared without ever acknowledging its value. It felt rote in that moment, just another transaction in the ledger of family debts that only I seemed to be keeping track of. But as the day dragged on with Mike holding court in the living room regaling everyone with tales of his latest big interview that sounded more like a pipe dream than a legitimate opportunity, and Aunt Linda piping icing onto gingerbread men with flour-streaked hands that trembled slightly from too many late nights, I felt the full weight of it all pressing down harder than ever before, a crushing realization that my role as the fixer had morphed into something far more burdensome than I ever intended. That evening after the kids finally crashed from sugar highs and the adults cracked open a second round of boxed wine to loosen tongues and lower inhibitions, Linda launched into her predictable annual plea during a lull in the conversation. Her eyes locking onto mine with that practiced mix of desperation and entitlement as she outlined how the family reunion planned for next summer in Florida would require covering flights and hotel rooms for everyone since times were tough all around, suggesting sweetly that I could handle the bulk of it because, after all, I was doing so well, and it would mean the world to see us all together under the sun. I chuckled softly to diffuse the tension rising in my chest, playing it off as my usual light-hearted banter by responding that sure, I could contribute, but only if she took charge of the entertainment portion, perhaps organizing a magic show where money could magically appear out of thin air to cover the costs, without anyone having to dip into their own pockets, and they all laughed along thinking it was just my quirky sense of humor shining through as always, but in truth, it marked my first deliberate jab, a witty sidestep that caught her off guard and left her blinking in mild confusion, while a spark of satisfaction bloomed warm and sharp inside me, like finally hanging up on a persistent telemarketer who refuses to take no for an answer. It was a small victory amid the growing fog of unease that clouded the room, but then the real twist arrived unannounced, like an unexpected bill in the mail. As I helped clear the scattered plates and utensils from the coffee table, only to have Uncle Bob approach me quietly with a crumpled envelope in his calloused hands, claiming it was just an old family photo album he'd found while cleaning out the garage, but tucked inside the faded pages was that very letter I'd written to Mom right after the divorce 5 years earlier, promising to always be there for the family, no matter what challenges came our way, a heartfelt note from a time when I was still raw and vulnerable, believing that emotional support flowed both ways without the hidden strings of financial obligation. He'd kept it apparently as some kind of memento, or so he claimed, with his eyes darting away from direct contact in a manner that struck me as oddly evasive, like there was far more to the story than he let on, muttering under his breath that I was truly the rock of the family, the one who held everything together through sheer willpower and resources that no one else could muster. I pocketed the envelope without pressing him further in the moment, but unease settled deep in my gut like a stone as the night wound down, with yawns and goodnights exchanged amid the twinkling lights strung across the mantel. And once I was alone in my car driving away under the glow of streetlights adorned with holiday garlands, I unfolded the letter under the dim dashboard light, only to discover scribbled in the margins in Linda's distinctive looping handwriting a note that read, "She owes us for all the support we provided back then during her tough times." A phrase that made no sense at all, because what support had they ever given me beyond empty words and occasional casseroles that tasted more of obligation than affection? Owes us. The words echoed in my head as questions multiplied. What exactly did they think I owed, and why drag up the past now when the present demands were already straining my patience to the breaking point? The pieces of this puzzle refusing to fit neatly together, yet hinting at a larger picture shrouded in secrecy that left me unsettled and alert. That's precisely when I overheard them again as I idled in the driveway a moment longer than intended, their voices carrying faintly from the porch, where Linda hissed urgently to Mike to just play nice and keep up the charm, because they had a solid plan in place to ensure the cash would keep flowing steadily without interruption, her tone laced with conspiracy that sent a chill racing down my spine, unrelated to the winter air seeping through the vents. A plan. My hands tightened involuntarily on the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. And suddenly Christmas dinner the following day felt less like a warm family tradition and more like an elaborate trap sprung with careful precision to catch me off guard at the most vulnerable moment. If they truly believed I was nothing but an easy mark ripe for the picking without any fight left in me, they were in for a rude awakening, because I was already flipping the script in my mind, starting with a gift of boundaries they wouldn't see coming until it was too late to backpedal. The next morning broke with a crispness that felt almost mocking in its deceptive clarity. Sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains like it was determined to pretty up the tangled mess of emotions and suspicions I was carrying after that porch conversation the night before. And as I loaded my arms with wrapped presents that I'd carefully selected to be thoughtful without being extravagant, the kind that show care but don't scream financial desperation, I drove back to Mom and Dad's house earlier than usual, hoping to slip in before the full frenzy of Christmas Eve brunch took hold, only to find the place already buzzing with the sizzle of pancakes on the griddle and the rich aroma of brewing coffee that promised a temporary truce in the undercurrents of expectation swirling around me like smoke from a hidden fire. Mom enveloped me in one of her signature hugs the moment I crossed the threshold, her whisper warm against my ear about how proud she was of the life I'd built all on my own since the divorce. But even as her words landed softly, I caught the way her eyes flicked toward the growing pile of gifts under the artificial tree in the living room. A pile already outnumbered by the invisible IOUs etched into my memory from years of one-sided support that had become as routine as the holiday decorations themselves. Brunch unfolded in the dining room with plates stacked high with fluffy pancakes drizzled in maple syrup and strips of bacon crisping on the side. The table a chaotic spread of chatter and clinking silverware where Uncle Bob dominated one end with stories from the auto shop about customers who haggled over every penny, while Cousin Mike hovered nearby nursing his second cup of coffee and eyeing me with that familiar mix of sheepishness and calculation that always preceded his requests for help. It didn't take long for Mike to make his move, cornering me by the Christmas tree adorned with mismatched ornaments collected over decades as he spun out a detailed tale about how his old car had finally given up the ghost in the driveway just yesterday, leaving Jenny stressed to the breaking point with the holidays bearing down and no reliable way to shuttle the kids to their activities or get to her part-time job at the mall. His voice dropping low and earnest as he pleaded for a loan to cover the towing and initial repairs until his next paycheck cleared, framing it all as a temporary setback in what he assured me was his upward climb toward stability that everyone knew was more wishful thinking than reality. I stood there listening with nods that masked the internal tally running through my head. This would mark the third such loan just this year alone, and the previous one had evaporated into thin air without so much as a thank you note or a partial repayment that might have restored a sliver of trust, while the room continued its lively hum with Aunt Linda slicing fresh fruit into a bowl at the counter, her knife flashing rhythmically, and Uncle Bob fiddling with the old radio to tune in some classic carols that crackled through the speakers like distant echoes of happier times. The dilemma hit me square in the chest with a force that made my coffee taste suddenly bitter: say no outright and risk being painted as the villain who abandoned family in their hour of need, or keep feeding into this endless cycle and wake up resenting myself even more for the weakness that allowed it to persist. And I could almost hear the audience in my head shaking their heads, wondering why I didn't just cut the cord clean and walk away from the toxicity that had seeped into every gathering, like mold in the walls of this aging house. Instead of a blunt refusal that might shatter the fragile peace hanging over the brunch table, I opted for a path of witty deflection that carried just enough edge to serve as my first real taste of revenge in this escalating game, suggesting to Mike with a smile that tugged at the corners of my mouth, how about I cover the towing fee right now, but in exchange he commits to paying me back through honest yard work at my place, since my lawn had turned into an overgrown jungle during the busy fall season, a proposal that made him grin in visible relief while drawing chuckles from the others who mistook it for my typical generous spirit laced with humor. They bought the act completely, thinking it sweet and sisterly, but in truth it was a calculated shift that put the onus back on him to sweat a little for once, turning what could have been another free pass into something resembling accountability, even if only on the surface. And as I muttered to myself later while rinsing plates in the sink that the boy was full of hot air, always blowing smoke without ever igniting the fire of real effort, a touch of light vulgarity colored my private thoughts in that folksy way that kept the bitterness from overwhelming me entirely. It felt like a tiny a momentary satisfaction that eased the knot in my stomach amid the thickening fog of unease that seemed to blanket the entire house as the morning bled into afternoon, with kids darting underfoot and wrapping paper rustling in anticipation of the day's activities. Then the twist descended like a faulty ornament tumbling from the highest branch of the tree without warning, striking me as I volunteered to help Mom rummage through the dusty attic for extra decorations stored in forgotten boxes that hadn't seen the light in seasons, the air up there thick with the scent of mothballs and old paper as we pulled down bins labeled in her neat handwriting from holidays long past. while sifting through one particularly heavy container filled with tangled strings of lights and faded garlands. I rediscovered that envelope from Uncle Bob, the one with the letter I'd penned to Mom in the raw aftermath of the divorce, promising unwavering support for the family through whatever storms lay ahead, but this time as I flipped through the accompanying papers. That spilled out like secrets unwilling to stay buried. My eyes landed on faded bank statements from a full decade earlier when Dad's factory had laid him off in one of those brutal waves of downsizing that ravaged the Midwest, leaving him and Mom scrambling to make ends meet on unemployment checks that stretched thinner than the winter ice on the lake. There in the stark black ink of those records were the transfers I'd initiated from my very first substantial real estate commission back when I was still green and eager to prove my worth, sending money without a second thought, because that's what daughters do to keep the roof from caving in. Even as I scraped by on ramen noodles and late rent in my tiny apartment and scrawled across the margins in Aunt Linda's unmistakable looping script were notes tallying it all as Sarah's contribution to the pot, a mysterious communal fund they'd apparently been pooling from my handouts over the years, doling out portions to cover their individual shortfalls without ever looping me in on the full extent or asking if I could truly afford to keep pouring into what felt like a bottomless well. The pot, the phrase echoed in my mind as uncertainty clawed its way deeper into my thoughts. What else had they concealed in this web of dependencies? And why dredge it all up now when the pressure to contribute even more was mounting with every passing hour? The discovery painting a picture of coordinated exploitation that made my skin crawl with the realization that my generosity had been weaponized against me in ways I never imagined. As the day blurred onward into evening with the kids ripping into a few early presents under Mom's indulgent eye and the adults raising glasses in toasts to better times ahead that rang hollow in my ears, I played my part to perfection, smiling through the ache that gnawed at my resolve and exchanging pleasantries that masked the turmoil brewing inside like a storm cloud gathering force behind a sunny facade. But that letter burned a hole in my pocket, a tangible clue to the larger conspiracy simmering just out of sight. And when Aunt Linda lifted her glass during one such toast, her eyes locking onto mine with feigned warmth as she proclaimed to Sarah, our holiday hero, the one who makes it all possible, the irony twisted like a knife, because hero or hostage the line had blurred beyond recognition, leaving me to question how much longer I could pretend before the mask cracked wide open. The conflict swelled around me, thick and impending, as preparations for the big Christmas dinner the following day ramped up, with last-minute shopping lists and table settings clinking in the background. And I excused myself early from the gathering, citing a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination as I slipped out into the cooling dusk, wondering if confronting this tangled mess would finally shatter the illusions holding us all captive, or carve out the space I desperately needed to breathe free. Christmas dinner loomed on the horizon, about to get ugly in ways that would expose every hidden debt and unspoken grudge, forcing choices that could redefine the family forever or fracture it beyond repair. Christmas Day arrived wrapped in a deceptive calm that settled over the neighborhood like a fresh blanket of snow hiding the uneven ground beneath. The kind of quiet where the house glowed with multicolored lights strung along the eaves and the oven hummed steadily with the promise of turkey roasting to golden perfection. But deep down I knew the fuse had been lit days ago, during those whispered conversations and unearthed letters that now weighed on my mind heavier than the gifts I carried. Through the front door I walked in with 2 bottles of Cabernet clutched under one arm, the deep red variety that paired perfectly with holiday meals and had become my standard contribution to these gatherings ever since I'd started earning enough to afford the good stuff without batting an eye, only to be enveloped immediately in a wave of hugs and holly-scented embraces from Mom, who fussed over my coat, and Dad, who clapped me on the back with his usual gruff affection, though their warmth struck me as rehearsed, almost like actors delivering lines from a well-worn script that masked the undercurrents of expectation running through the family like electrical wires, ready to spark at the slightest friction. The dining room table had been extended to its full length, groaning under the weight of Mom's elaborate spread that included the massive turkey she'd brined overnight until it emerged juicy and aromatic, mounds of mashed potatoes whipped creamy with butter and cream, Green beans simmered in a bath of bacon fat and onions for that smoky depth everyone raved about, and cranberry relish she'd made from scratch using berries from the farmer's market that added a tart brightness to the otherwise heavy feast, with 20 of us crammed around the mismatched chairs that creaked under the collective weight of bodies and histories accumulated over decades of similar meals. Uncle Bob took charge of the carving knife with practiced precision, slicing the bird into portions that steamed invitingly, while Dad poured generous splashes of my wine into stem glasses that clinked together in the opening toasts to health and happiness that echoed through the room, filled with the scents of sage and rosemary mingling with the faint pine from the living room tree. But even as the cheers rose, I could sense the subtle digs beginning to weave their way into the conversation like threads pulling tighter on an already strained fabric. Mike kicked it off with his trademark joke about my fancy realtor life closing deals on million-dollar homes, while the rest of us scraped by on 9-to-5s that barely covered the mortgage, winking across the table as if it were all harmless banter shared among siblings, but landing with a sour note that reminded me of the loans he'd never repaid and the opportunities he'd squandered. While Jenny piled my plate high with seconds unprompted, saying I worked too hard and needed to eat up to keep my strength for all the clients demanding her time and energy. Aunt Linda positioned herself at the head of the table like she owned the rights to the holiday itself, leaning in with her wineglass balanced delicately in one hand, as she proclaimed how I'd been such a blessing this entire year covering this expense and spotting that shortfall without complaint, her voice carrying that false cheer that grated against my nerves because it directly echoed the laundry room whisper I'd overheard days earlier, reducing me to nothing more than a convenient financial lifeline for their endless stream of misfortunes. Laughter rippled through the group in response, but it felt forced and uneven, like ripples on a pond disturbed by a stone skipped with too much force. And in that moment my inner conflict raged fiercer than ever, a brutal tug-of-war between the part of me that wanted to laugh it off and preserve the fragile peace for Mom's sake, remembering her weary eyes after Dad's layoffs and the casseroles she'd brought during my divorce that tasted of genuine care, versus the hardening resolve built from years of independence that screamed for me to call out the exploitation before it swallowed me whole entirely. Why keep playing nice when the audience watching this unfold in their own minds might urge me to stand up right then and shatter the illusion? Yet family isn't a light switch you flip off without consequences. It's a knot of loyalties and guilts that unravels slowly, pulling threads from every direction until you're left wondering if the effort is worth the frayed ends. I waded through the mains, fork in hand, picking at the food that suddenly seemed tasteless as stories flowed freely around the table, the kids recounting their school plays with wide-eyed exaggeration, Uncle Bob venting about the latest woes at the auto shop where parts costs had skyrocketed and customers haggled like it was a flea market, and Linda weaving in tales of her so-called grandkids fund that suspiciously aligned with her daydreams of a cruise to the Caribbean she'd mentioned more than once over the past months. Then came the opening for my next act of revenge, crafted to be clever and cloaked in the humor they expected from me, turning what could have been an explosive confrontation into a pointed deflection that would linger longer than any outburst. As Mike brought up his latest opportunity during a lull in the carving, a vague startup idea in the tech space that needed seed money to get off the ground, and he looked right at me with those hopeful eyes, suggesting I could be the perfect investor given my business savvy. I smiled wide enough to light the candles on the table, responding that it sounded promising, and reminded him of that app he'd pitched to everyone last year, the one promising to revolutionize local deliveries, but ended up as a money pit, draining his enthusiasm faster than it generated revenue, adding with a wink that I'd be happy to contribute my advice on the business plan, but as for cash, I was all tapped out on performing miracles this season, a quip that drew tittering laughter from the aunts and cousins, while Mike's face flushed a deep crimson and Linda shot me a sharp glance that missed its mark entirely. The table erupted in chuckles, mistaking my words for the quirky humor that had always been my shield, but in reality it served as satisfying revenge, a witty parry that exposed his patterns without direct accusation, leaving him to stew in the discomfort of his own history while I savored the shift in power dynamics, however subtle it might appear on the surface. Light vulgarity flickered in my thoughts as I watched him squirm full of hot air, that boy always inflating dreams without the substance to back them up. A private chuckle that kept the bitterness from boiling over into something uglier amid the holiday facade. The twist materialized midway through dessert as pie slices were passed around with scoops of vanilla ice cream melting slowly on the warm crust and coffee steamed in mugs that bore family reunion logos from years past. When Dad pulled me aside into the relative quiet of the kitchen under the pretense of needing help with the dishes, his voice dropping low and hesitant as he brought up that old letter from the attic mentioning how Linda had referenced it earlier in the week about the family debts from his layoff era and how they hadn't meant to burden me, but things were tighter than ever with the pension checks shrinking and unexpected medical bills piling up like snowdrifts after a blizzard. Debts, the word hung in the air, connecting directly to the bank statements I'd uncovered, the pooled contributions they'd siphoned from my earnings over a decade without transparency or thanks. And in that revelation it clicked into place as a coordinated effort to draw me deeper into their web, guilting me toward an even larger bailout that would secure their comfort at the expense of my hard-fought stability. Her slip at the table earlier, that careless "he's just our ATM," wasn't a mere error but a deliberate mask slipping to reveal the provider they assumed I would always be regardless of the toll it took. And uncertainty peaked within me like the rising steam from the sink as I glanced back toward the living room where the group had huddled again, their voices hushed in what looked like another secretive conference that tied every clue together into a conspiracy of entitlement. The air in the kitchen felt smaller, more oppressive, with the conflict boiling hotter as demands went unspoken yet palpable in every glance and half-finished sentence. And I rejoined them with my heart hammering against my ribs, forcing smiles through the remainder of dessert as carols faded into awkward silences broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. The evening dragged on with the weight of impending confrontation hanging like fog over the festivities, and when the check for the catered appetizers arrived unexpectedly, no one had mentioned ordering those fancy shrimp puffs and cheese platters that had inflated the total far beyond the usual homemade affair. I saw the padded numbers staring back like an accusation of their greed. They all turned to me expectant as always, their eyes conveying the silent assumption that I'd cover it without question. But inside, the revenge I'd been cultivating brewed to a fever pitch, demanding release before they could cash another emotional check drawn on my soul's reserves. The full dinner bill finally hit the table amid the clearing of plates and the folding of napkins, and I knew without a doubt that the moment had arrived to stand up not just in body, but in spirit, before the cycle repeated for another year unchecked and unchallenged. The dinner plates had been cleared away with efficient scrapes of forks against porcelain and stacked precariously in the kitchen sink, where the soapy water waited to dissolve the remnants of the feast that had filled the air with savory aromas for hours on end. But the real wreckage of the evening was only just beginning to unfold in the living room, where laughter had faded into murmurs, and the kids played quietly in the adjacent den with the new toys they'd unwrapped earlier, their excitement a stark contrast to the tension coiling tighter among the adults who lingered over steaming mugs of coffee laced with hints of cinnamon and the last dregs of dessert crumbs scattered across the tablecloth like forgotten confetti. Aunt Linda held court from her favored armchair near the fireplace, her voice carrying that practiced false cheer as she recounted tales from the old days when the family had been through lean times together, scraping by on Dad's factory wages and Mom's part-time sewing gigs that barely covered the grocery bills, painting a picture of unity and shared struggle as if my financial interventions over the past decade hadn't been the invisible glue holding their precarious lives intact, without which the entire structure might have crumbled long ago under the weight of unpaid mortgages and mounting credit card debts. Uncle Bob nodded along in agreement, his face ruddy from the wine and the warmth of the crackling fire, while Cousin Mike scrolled absently through his phone, pretending to check messages, but really avoiding eye contact with anyone who might press him about his stalled career. And Mom busied herself refilling creamers, her gaze darting away from mine, as if she sensed the storm circling closer with every passing minute that separated the meal from the moment of reckoning. The catered extras, those fancy shrimp puffs and artisanal cheese platters that no one had bothered to mention ordering beforehand, had mysteriously inflated the overall bill far Beyond what a simple home-cooked spread would have cost, turning what should have been a modest family affair into an extravagant tally that screamed of deliberate excess designed to test the limits of my generosity. And now that crisp receipt lay in the center of the table, totaling $400 with line items that included delivery fees and gratuities padded just enough to make my stomach turn as I realized the orchestration behind it all, tying directly back to the whispers and huddles I'd witnessed over the past days. I'd remained quiet through the heart of the meal, picking at the turkey and potatoes that now sat heavy in my gut, while the twists from earlier revelations swirled relentlessly in my mind. The unearthed letter, with its marginal notes, the pooled bank transfers from my early commissions that had vanished into their communal pot without a trace of accountability, and Linda's careless slips that reduced my hard-earned success to nothing more than a convenient ATM for their endless needs, stirring a maelstrom of emotions that churned deep within. Anger at their unapologetic gall for treating family bonds as a one-way transaction, guilt for even contemplating walking away from the people who'd shaped my childhood despite their flaws, and that profound, disagreeable ache of loving them through the betrayal because blood runs thicker than any bank statement ever could. Why hadn't I shut this down seasons ago? The voice in my head echoed, almost as if anticipating the audience's frustration, urging me to bolt from the table and sever the ties that bound me to this cycle of exploitation. Yet family dynamics aren't dismantled with a single dramatic exit. They're woven from years of shared holidays and quiet sacrifices that pull you back even as your instincts scream to run, leaving you trapped in the limbo of loyalty and self-preservation. The air thickened palpably as Linda finally slid the bill across the polished wood toward me with a casual flick of her wrist. Her smile all sugar without the spice as she cooed that I was up for the honors, our holiday elf swooping in to save the day once again, just like always. Her words landing like the final straw that snapped the fragile thread of patience I'd been clinging to throughout the entire gathering. That's when it all boiled over in a rush that had been building since that first whisper in the laundry room days earlier. I rose from my chair, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor in a sound that cut through the murmurs like a knife, silencing the room as forks paused midair and breaths caught collectively in throats that suddenly felt too tight for the words hanging unspoken. I met her eyes directly for the first time that evening, my voice steady and laced with a wry edge honed from years of closing tough real estate deals, saying, "You know, Aunt Linda, I've been your ATM for far longer than I care to count, spotting Mike's rent when his jobs fizzle out, covering Uncle Bob's roof repairs, and your little emergency funds that stretch to bingo wins and dream vacations. But even machines have limits, and this one's officially out of service, leaving no room for misinterpretation or backpedaling from the truth I'd laid bare." Silence crashed down, electric and profound, enveloping the space like a sudden blackout, where Linda's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Mike choked on a sip of his cooling coffee, sputtering into his napkin, while Dad's jaw slackened in shock, his eyes widening with a mix of confusion and dawning recognition that the family equilibrium he'd taken for granted was fracturing right before him. I reached into my purse, pulling out exact cash for my individual share, nothing more, and dropped it onto the table with a soft thud that resonated louder than any shout. Pay up, folks, because family means sharing the load equally, not riding on one person's back until it buckles under the strain, a declaration that carried the weight of every ignored IOU and unthanked wire transfer accumulated over years of quiet endurance. The twist unraveled then in a cascade of admissions prompted by the stunned hush. Linda stammered through her defense, revealing the plan they'd hatched in those porch huddles, pooling my old contributions to cover a hidden family debt to a loan shark from Dad's layoff decade, a desperate measure they'd kept from me, fearing I'd refuse to help back then, but one that had snowballed into this coordinated squeeze designed to guilt me into perpetual bailouts without ever disclosing the full sordid history scrawled in those letter margins and bank notes I'd discovered. It all connected seamlessly, the whispers, the padded bill, the evasive glances, forming a conspiracy of entitlement that made my blood run cold even as satisfaction surged through me for finally voicing the unspoken reality that had poisoned the holidays for too long. My revenge unfolded not in screams or slammed doors, but in that simple act of boundaries. Drawn with wit and finality, I sat back down, slowly sipping my coffee as they fumbled for wallets and purses, the power shifting palpably like snow melting under a relentless sun, exposing the ground beneath. And when Mike mumbled a half-hearted apology, his voice thick with embarrassment, I quipped back, "Don't worry, I'll send the invoice for all that emotional labor I've provided over the years free of charge this time," a light-hearted jab that eased the tension just enough to prevent total meltdown, while landing the point with precision that humor could sharpen better than anger ever might. Light vulgarity tinged my inner relief as I watched them scramble, full of excuses and stuck in their own mud, for once a folksy satisfaction that kept the moment from descending into outright chaos amid the twinkling lights and half-eaten pie. But as checks were scratched out reluctantly and excuses flew like errant napkins, Mike blaming bad luck, Linda glaring daggers across the table, and Mom squeezing my hand under the cloth in a gesture torn between pride and sorrow, the ambiguity settled over the room like the fading embers in the fireplace, leaving questions to linger in the air. Did I burn irreplaceable bridges with this stand, or merely build necessary walls to protect what I'd earned? Would they slink back next year with feigned changes, or test my resolve until it cracked under renewed pressure? The evening thawed gradually into awkward toasts that rang with newfound caution, and hugs at the door that felt tentatively real for the first time. Stripped of assumptions, I drove away into the enveloping dark, the snowflakes swirling against my headlights, with a wallet lighter by only my fair share, but a heart heavier with the uncertainties of what family meant when generosity turned to greed. In the quiet of the highway stretching toward Columbus, I pondered if the machine was truly broken beyond repair, or merely recalibrating for a future where contributions flowed both ways, a thought-provoking void that kept sleep at bay and perhaps mirrored the unease settling in your own mind as the story closes, without tidy answers, only the raw truth of boundaries reclaimed at the cost of comfort.